When humanity first entered the chaos of the galactic arena, they were little more than an up-and-coming alien race. Hundreds had come before them, and hundreds had perished in the wake of war and hardships brought on by alien diseases and inability to adapt. Within decades, however, they quickly proved themselves to be creative in all wakes of life, from military might to savviness in commerce and politics. Even so, that they carried the reputation of being absolute maniacs in their tactics, and monsters when it came to seeing their missions through to the end. At least, that was what his father told him. It had painted the picture of a chaotic race of aliens, a menace to society, as they themselves often put it in the tabloids. His first exchange with a human, however, proved anything but that. Davidson, as he came to know the man, was as chaotic as a block of stone and equally outgoing. The human was the definition of stoic and introverted, speaking only if spoken to, and never more than what was needed. Yet that in itself proved one other thing that was said about humans. That when you truly got to interact with one, it would change your life in one way or another. The faint hum of the ventilation system filled the otherwise silent building, its constant thrumming leaning into what would have been an eerie ambience. Were it not for the other sentient being that sat a few meters from him, at the opposite end of their security office, Kryinit would have truly found this entire shift to be incredibly terrifying. However, as the galactic economy continued to adjust for an ever-expanding population and demands for resource and trade, he would fall in line with every one of the other 200 billion individuals in the galaxy, and settle into a quiet life of working a common job, earning his salary as the solar cycles whittled away. That was the plan, though, wasn't it? As a member of the worker caste, what else was there for him? From his earliest days as a young larvae, he could recall his father always speaking highly of how his children were all proudly accepted into the warrior caste of their insectoid species, as the humans often call them. Each one of his dozen siblings had proudly borne the banner of the Homeworld's Defense Force, a few even managing to reach esteemed posts within the military. Some were tasked with guiding operations, and others in charge of their own units, platoons and companies, as his human partner labelled them. And yet here he was, tasked with a common job, living a common life, likely to work it until his life expired. If he was fortunate, perhaps he'd meet a female of his species that was accepting of this humble post, and not keen to run off the moment a more respectable member of the warrior caste turned their gaze on her. Was that all there was, though? Was this routine going to be his sentence for the rest of his life cycle? It was depressing just to think about, because what would his life amount to beyond a common worker's mundane life? He would have no stories to tell his children and grandchildren, nothing for his parents to be proud of. He would just fade into nothing. "Something's on your mind," stated the human, Davidson. Kryinit felt a choked breath leave his mouth and escape the small mandibles at each of its sides, before he turned his head 180 degrees, catching sight of Davidson. The dark-skinned human had yet to turn his head in Kryinit's direction, instead focusing his gaze on the monitors before him. 9 in total, 8 of which showcased each of the corridors to the eastern wing of the production facility, while the 9th was displaying a physical contest of some sort. Honestly, Kryinit has stopped trying to understand human athletics long ago. During his training orientation at the facility, he'd overheard a discussion over human athletes. While his species, the Clatum, were no strangers to contests of physical strength in the name of competition and glory, they only had a dozen or so methods of competing. The humans, much to the credit of their ingenuity and creativity, had hundreds of contests. While some were fairly similar, others were vastly different, from the objectives to the rule sets and subsequent style of play. "Oh, yes, there is," he replied, feeling his thoughts race at the fact that the human had somehow deduced his current state. "How did you know?" he asked, turning his chair so that his body now faced the same direction as his face, and numerous eyes. Davidson, however, never took his eyes off of his entertainment pad, instead maintaining his gaze on what seemed like 2 human males of differing complexions as they fight in hand-to-hand combat. "Because when you're relaxed, you let out a strange chirp every 10 or 15 minutes, and you're always keen to start conversation. We're 2 hours into our shift and you haven't said a single word. besides whatever was on your patrol notes," he explained, catching Corinnet off guard. Davidson, contrary to the public image humans had been painted in, was a rather stoic and reserved individual, which was even stranger, as he knew for a fact that the dark-skinned human was what many called a former Marine. He had served in several tours in various human conflicts before he left the human military to pursue a smaller and more quiet career. In the 6 months that Corinnet had worked with him, Davidson had never once shown interest in Corinet's tales, or even expressed an ounce of awareness in his chirping. If anything, Corinnet had written it off as his body functioning at a decibel that perhaps human ears couldn't register. Turns out they could. "I was not aware you could hear it," Corinnet admitted sheepishly, before turning back to face his own monitors along the western wing. "I am not sure what is wrong with me. I simply feel strange. Hollow, almost. Confused and conflicted, yet I cannot truly tell why," answered Corinnet. He wasn't even sure why he was telling the human his current struggle, given that it was not something he knew his people did. He'd never heard of his father or brothers being so open with their thoughts, yet some part of him urged him to do so. Davison, yet again, never turned to face Corinnet, instead continuing on with spectating his sport. "Conflicted with what?" he asked, yet again surprising Corinnet, who hadn't expected his human partner to probe any further. This was not the kind of conversations he was accustomed to, given that the Clayton species was renowned for their introverted nature. "With the job, I'm guessing," added the human, causing Corinnet to let out a chortle click of his mandibles, before a chirp escaped his rear legs. For the first time, Davison angled his head only marginally, briefly making eye contact with him before turning back to face the video feed on his entertainment pad. "What about the job?" he asked. Corinnet paused before leaning back in his chair and looking up to stare at the ceiling. "That, as a Clayton in the worker caste, this could very well be the pinnacle of my life cycle," he answered finally before adding on. "My brothers are all warriors, renowned and famed, and have even achieved numerous awards. Yet here I am working a simple security job for a facility they have not even heard of. I feel empty. I feel hollow. Frustrated, perhaps," he blurted, not truly aware of how much he was giving away. Davison finally broke away from his video feed, resting an elbow on one of the armrests before nodding in silence. He still hadn't faced Corinnet, however. "It isn't the greatest job, that's true. The pay is shit, the benefits are non-existent, and it's boring as hell," he grunted, causing the Clayton to snort, his mandibles clicking once more. "You get no recognition, nobody acknowledges your efforts, you don't win the ladies over with your barely livable wages, and it's very lonely," he carried on, bringing the brief moment of humour to an end. Corinnet settled down once more before nodding at Davidson's words. "I feel inadequate, I suppose," commented Corinnet, as his chirping came to a stop as well. "I feel like perhaps I should have done something more with my life. Maybe I could have tried harder during the caste exams, and perhaps I could have joined the Defense Force alongside my siblings," admitted the alien. Davison took his turn to nod before shaking his head. "Did you want to be in the Defense Force?" asked Davison, to which Corinnet hesitated to answer. "Did you really know what you would be getting into if you had joined?" he questioned. A part of Corinnet wanted to say that he did, but if he had to be honest, "I don't know," he conceded. Davison nodded before playing his video feed once more. "Most don't," pointed out the human. "And by the time they find out, they've already wasted years of their life doing something they realize they never wanted to do. The moment that realization strikes is often one of the most numbing experiences ever. So much loss and pain you witness, and for what?" "You believe that me desiring to join the warrior caste was a mistake in the making?" "That's something only you can answer, but each time you've brought it up, you've always tied your siblings into it. You never once mentioned what you aspired to do in the Defense Force, or even what your personal reasons were for joining," replied Davison, causing Corinnet to once more stop in the middle of his thoughts as he processed the words. It was true, though, that he never once stopped to think of what he wanted to do or why he even wanted to do it in the first place. "Did you even know what you wanted to be once you entered the Defense Force?" he piled on, as Korinit shook his head. "No, I simply thought I wanted to join," he informed Davidson. After a moment, however, more words gradually escaped. "My father always wanted us to become leaders, though. He always spoke of how honorable it was to lead the warriors into war, commanders and strategists." Silence slowly blanketed the security office, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. "I wanted to be a medic," Korinit explained. "It was a newer role. It was only formed a decade ago, when humanity first introduced the concept after our trade and alliance agreement. I found it amazing that in a force designed to go to war, you could have roles meant to save lives and not extinguish them. However, because it was so new, there was little history and glory to it. You were celebrated for the kills you collected, never the lives you saved. My father always said it was a coward's profession in the new era," he added. There was a sound that escaped Davidson, though Korinit couldn't quite tell if it had been his imagination. Were he to describe it, though, he could have sworn it sounded like disgust. "It's your life, not his," he stated, before returning to his video feed. Korinit sat there for several moments in silence, taking in the brief exchange he and Davison had shared. His own life, not his father's. That had been 20 solar rotations ago. 20 years, as the humans called it, at an age he now considered barely out of the larvae cycle, where his own children were now entering. He only stayed at that posting for a few solar cycles, days, before he walked into the newly established Human Xeno Marine Corps office in the wake of the Human K2 Alliance. He'd chosen to take the plunge on his accord, detaching himself from the expectations that his family once bore on him. He never did get a chance to thank Davidson for their conversation, given how quickly the Corps was shipping out their recruits, but the human never strayed far from his thoughts. Leaning his head against the tip of his grabber, hand as the humans called it, Korinit closed his 6 eyes and took in a deep breath. There was hardly a sound in his office, save for the quiet hum of the ventilation system, which he now found a comforting reminder of that lone conversation he once had with a particular human in the job that held no future for him. It had been so long ago that he could hardly make out the features of Davidson, yet the name and words themselves would never be forgotten, even if he were on his deathbed and suffering from old age. "Sir, your next appointment is here," interrupted a voice through the intercommunications network, directly transferring the data to his neural link. Korinit cleared his throat and straightened up, standing to his 4 legs as he stepped over towards the door of his office, opening it up for a chance to signal to his secretary to allow the next patient inside. "He filled out the paperwork. He didn't go into detail, but it seems he is dealing with the passing of his grandfather, and he is struggling with handling the loss," she explained, handing him the packets. "What's his name again?" he asked, having already lost track of the 8 appointments he'd lined up today. The young woman, a human with strawberry blonde hair and a fair complexion, glanced down at her notes and traced a fingertip along the names. Jameer Davidson. He mentioned that you may have known his grandfather. He claims the man followed your military career heavily. I don't know what to make of it, though," she replied. Korinit let out a soft chirp before nodding. "Send him in, please,"